An IQ test is one of the strangest situations you will ever be in. You sit alone. There is one correct answer. Nobody interrupts you. Nobody disagrees with your reasoning, needs you to explain it more gently, or reacts badly to how you phrase your response. There is no negotiation, no ambiguity about what's being asked, and no cost to being wrong other than a number at the end. Almost nothing in an actual life works like that. A performance review isn't a puzzle with a fixed answer. Neither is a disagreement with a business partner, a conversation with a teenager who has stopped talking to you, or a project that depends on 4 people who each want something slightly different from it. Those situations come with incomplete information, people who don't say what they mean, timing that matters, and your own nervous system reacting in real time to what's happening. Intelligence, in the IQ sense, was never built to measure performance under those conditions. It measures how well you process information when the information is the only variable. For most of the 20th century, that gap didn't matter as much as you'd expect. Raw analytical capacity, holding a lot of information in mind, calculating quickly, remembering detail, spotting patterns, was genuinely scarce. Most jobs needed someone who could do that reliably, and there weren't many easy substitutes for a person who was simply good at it. So intelligence tests correlated with outcomes reasonably well, not because thinking clearly under pressure with other people didn't matter, but because raw processing power was still the bottleneck in a lot of work. That bottleneck has been moving. By 2026, a huge amount of the analytical work that used to separate a high performer from an average one can be done by a tool sitting in someone's pocket. Summarizing a contract, catching an error in a spreadsheet, generating 3 strategic options for a problem, remembering the exact clause from a meeting 2 months ago. None of that requires a person who happens to have unusually high processing speed anymore. It requires a person who knows what to ask for and can tell when the answer is wrong. The scarce resource has shifted from having the information to knowing what to do with it once several people, each with their own interests and reactions, are involved. This is the actual shift worth paying attention to. Not emotional intelligence is nicer than IQ. That's the version of this idea that gets repeated so often it stops meaning anything. The real shift is narrower and more specific. As analytical throughput becomes cheap and available to everyone, the thing that still separates people is whether they can act well on that information in the presence of other humans, uncertainty, and their own reactions. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. 2 people get the same piece of critical feedback from a manager. Both are smart enough to understand exactly what's being said. One person hears it, feels a spike of defensiveness, and responds immediately, explaining, justifying, quietly building a case for why the criticism is unfair. The other person feels the same spike, notices it, says something like, "Let me think about that," and actually does think about it before responding. The information both of them received was identical. What differed was a few seconds of self-management that changed everything that happened afterward. Whether the manager felt heard, whether the relationship absorbed the friction, whether the actual point in the feedback got used or got lost in defending against it. That's not a personality trait. It's a specific, learnable skill, noticing your own reaction before it drives your behavior. Most people can eventually explain why they got defensive after the fact with total clarity. The skill isn't insight after the moment. It's the half second of noticing during the moment, while the reaction is still small enough to work with. A second example, because this idea is easy to nod along to and hard to actually picture. A team is behind on a deadline, and one person on the team has quietly stopped contributing at their usual level. The technically smartest response is to point out, correctly, that the person is falling behind, and it's affecting the group. That response is accurate, and it will probably make things worse, because it treats a human problem as an information problem. The person who gets a better outcome usually isn't smarter. They're better at reading what's underneath the behavior before responding to the behavior itself. Maybe the person is overwhelmed by something outside work. Maybe they disagree with the direction of the project and have gone quiet instead of arguing. The accurate diagnosis and the useful diagnosis aren't always the same thing, and figuring out which one you're looking at requires paying attention to a person, not just to a fact. This is what emotional intelligence actually refers to. stripped of the vague self-help version of the phrase. It isn't being calm or nice or self-aware in some general sense. It's a small set of concrete abilities. Noticing your own reaction before you act on it, reading what someone actually needs versus what they're literally saying, adjusting how you communicate depending on who's receiving it, and tolerating the discomfort of not knowing something long enough to actually think instead of reacting. None of those are things a language model can do for you, and that's not a small detail. It's the entire reason this matters more now than it did 10 years ago. A tool can hand you the analysis. It cannot sit across from your co-founder during a disagreement about equity and read whether the tension in the room is about the numbers or about something that happened 6 months ago that never got resolved. It cannot decide in the moment whether to push a point or let it go. Those calls still have to be made by a person in real time with everything that comes with being a person. An actual reaction, a body, something at stake. There's a second layer to this worth being precise about, because it's easy to overstate. Intelligence hasn't stopped mattering. Understanding a complex problem still requires the capacity to understand it. What's changed is what intelligence alone gets you. A high IQ person with poor self-regulation and weak social red will still misjudge negotiations, alienate collaborators, and make confident decisions based on an inaccurate read of a room. And now they'll do it with better information than ever, because the information is cheap and easy to get. Bad judgment applied to good information doesn't produce good outcomes. It just produces confident bad outcomes, faster. Meanwhile, someone without exceptional analytical range, but with strong emotional regulation and social accuracy, has never had cheaper access to the analytical part. They can ask a tool to model 3 scenarios, check their reasoning, catch a blind spot in a plan. What they bring that the tool can't is the part that happens after the analysis. The read on when to raise something and when to sit on it. The ability to stay useful under pressure, instead of freezing or overreacting. The judgment about which piece of accurate information will land, and which will just create defensiveness. This also explains something that used to look like a contradiction. Workplaces full of very smart people that still function badly. It was never a contradiction. A room of high analytical capacity with low emotional regulation produces a specific, recognizable pattern. Everyone is technically right, nobody adjusts to anybody else, disagreements get argued instead of resolved, and the group makes worse decisions than several of its individual members would make alone. Intelligence doesn't prevent that. It can actually make it worse, because a sharp argument delivered with total confidence is harder to walk back than a vague one for the person making it and for everyone else in the room. There's a version of this playing out right now in how people hire. For a long time, a hiring process could lean heavily on testing raw ability, case studies, technical screens, puzzles designed to see how someone thinks under pressure. Those tests still tell you something, but more companies are noticing that the candidate who aces the technical screen doesn't reliably turn into the person who makes the team better once they're on it. The gap between those two things used to be smaller because the technical screen was doing more of the work of separating people. Now that a much wider range of candidates can produce a strong analytical answer, sometimes with help they don't disclose, sometimes because the bar for correct has simply gotten easier to clear. The technical screen tells you less than it used to. What starts to matter more in the interview is something closer to, does this person adjust when you push back on their answer, or do they just repeat it louder? Do they ask a clarifying question when the prompt is ambiguous, or guess and move on? Those are emotional intelligence questions wearing a technical interview costume, and they're becoming the actual signal, even when nobody on the hiring panel would describe it that way. There's also a quieter version of this happening in how people make decisions for themselves. Someone deciding whether to take a new job, end a relationship, or move cities used to lean heavily on gathering more information, reading more, asking more people, building a more complete picture before deciding. That instinct made sense when information was the harder part to get. Now the information is almost never the bottleneck. Anyone can generate a thorough pros and cons list, model out 5 years of 2 different paths, or find a dozen people's opinions in an afternoon. The part that still has to happen inside a single person is tolerating the discomfort of deciding without certainty, noticing which version of the decision is coming from fear and which is coming from an actual read of the situation, and living with a choice once it's made, instead of relitigating it every time doubt shows up. Gathering more information doesn't resolve that discomfort. At a certain point, it just delays the moment where the discomfort has to be handled directly, which is an emotional skill, not an analytical one. It's worth being honest about what this doesn't mean too. None of this means IQ has become irrelevant, and it's worth resisting the version of this argument that turns into, quote, smart isn't important, be a good person instead. That's not what's happening. What's happening is narrower. The specific competitive advantage that used to come from being able to process more information faster than the people around you is shrinking, because that capacity is now available to almost everyone through a device. What's left as a genuine differentiator is the part that was always harder to develop and impossible to outsource. Reading people accurately, managing your own reaction in real time, and knowing what to do with correct information once other humans are involved in what happens next. If there's a practical shift worth taking from this, it isn't work on your emotional intelligence, in the vague sense that phrase usually gets used. It's narrower than that too. It's noticing the next time you feel a reaction rising before you respond to something, an email, a piece of feedback, a disagreement, that the half second between the reaction and the response is where most of this actually happens, not in some deep well of self-understanding you're supposed to develop over years. In that half second, repeated often enough to become the way you tend to operate. The people who seem to navigate 2026 with a kind of ease that looks almost effortless aren't usually the ones with the most raw analytical horsepower. They're the ones who can take accurate information, increasingly cheap, increasingly available to everyone, and actually do something useful with it in a room full of other people who don't think exactly like they do. That was always a real skill. It's just no longer optional.